Every great composer eventually faces the same question. How do you revisit familiar territory without simply repeating yourself? Joseph LoDuca had already helped define the sound of The Evil Dead. Now he had to reinvent it. Fortunately, reinvention was something Sam Raimi had never been afraid of. If the original The Evil Dead was a relentless exercise in survival, Evil Dead 2 was something altogether stranger. Part horror, part slapstick comedy, part supernatural fever dream. Rather than remake the original or continue it in a conventional fashion, Raimi expanded the universe into something louder, stranger, and far more playful. The music had to evolve too. LeDuca understood that this wasn't simply a scarier film, it was a funnier one. But comedy and horror presents a unique challenge. If the score becomes too playful, the horror disappears. If it remains too serious, the jokes lose their impact. LeDuca walked that tightrope with remarkable confidence. The score shifts effortlessly between mounting dread and gleeful absurdity, often with the same scene. Ash's descent into madness, laughing maniacally as the mounted deer head joins in, is a perfect example. The music doesn't undercut the comedy, nor does it abandon the horror. Instead, it amplifies the surreal nature of the moment, encouraging us to laugh while never allowing us to feel completely safe. It's a delicate balancing act, and it's one of the reasons Evil Dead 2 remains such a singular achievement. By the time Army of Darkness arrived in 1992, everything had changed. Ash Williams was no longer simply surviving, he had become a hero. Reluctantly, sarcastically, accidentally. But a hero nonetheless, and heroes demand different music. Gone were the intimate, claustrophobic textures of the cabin. In their place came sweeping orchestral themes, triumphant brass, and adventurous rhythms that recalled the great fantasy epics of classic Hollywood. LoDuca embraced the shift wholeheartedly. The score feels bigger, more cinematic. It acknowledges influences from composers that shaped adventure and fantasy cinema while still entertaining that quirky DNA that had always defined the Evil Dead. Even amidst armies of skeletons and medieval castles, there remains something unmistakably LoDuca about the music. It never loses its mischievous edge, just like Ash himself. Although many horror fans will always associate Joseph LoDuca with the Evil Dead, limiting his career to one franchise would overlook an extraordinary body of work. Throughout the 1990s, LoDuca became one of television's most accomplished composers, scoring series such as Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, and Xena Warrior Princess. These productions demanded something very different. Week after week, he crafted music that balanced mythology, adventure, romance, and action, often on demanding television schedules. These experiences broadened his musical vocabulary enormously. Yet, no matter how expansive his career became, there remained one collaboration audiences hope to see continue: Sam Raimi. More than 3 decades after the original film, LaDuca returned to the world that helped launch his career with Ash vs. Evil Dead. By then, both composer and franchise had matured. The challenge was no longer to invent a musical identity, it was to honor one. Listening to the television series is like hearing an old friend again. The familiar motifs remain, but they carry years of accumulated experience. There's confidence where once there was uncertainty, scale where once there was necessity, nostalgia, certainly, but never complacency. The music understands something important. Ash has grown older. So have we. What makes Joseph LaDuca's work so enduring? Perhaps it is because his scores never chase fashion. They don't rely on whatever sound happened to dominate horror cinema at a particular moment. Instead, they serve character, story, atmosphere. Most importantly, they serve emotion. Even in the franchise's most outrageous moments, LoDuca never treats the material as a joke. He understands that horror only works if somebody believes it. The audience can laugh. Ash can crack a one-liner, but the music must always remain emotionally honest. That sincerity gives the Evil Dead films their remarkable elasticity. They can shift between terror and comedy because the score provides an emotional anchor. Without it, the tonal balancing act might collapse. Film history often celebrates directors, sometimes actors, occasionally cinematographers. Composers, however, frequently remain in the background, yet some creative partnerships become inseparable. Steven Spielberg and John Williams, Alfred Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann, Sergio Leone and Ennio Morricone. Sam Raimi and Joseph LoDuca deserve to stand comfortably within that tradition. Their collaboration demonstrates something profoundly important. Music doesn't merely accompany cinema, it helps define it. Ask yourself a simple question. Can you imagine The Evil Dead without LoDuca's score? Perhaps, but it wouldn't feel quite the same. The frantic camera would lose some of its momentum. The creeping dread would soften. The emotional rhythm would change. The music isn't decorating the film, it's part of the architecture. Joseph LoDuca once helped a group of ambitious friends make a tiny independent horror film deep in the Tennessee woods. Few could have predicted what would follow. A franchise spanning generations, a devoted global fan base, countless imitators, and a soundtrack that remains instantly recognizable to horror lovers around the world. The remarkable thing is that LoDuca never tried to overpower the films. He simply listened to what they needed. Sometimes they needed terror, sometimes absurdity, sometimes unexpected heroism. He gave them all three, and in doing so, he gave The Evil Dead its voice. If today's episode has inspired you to revisit Joseph LoDuca's extraordinary music, I highly recommend listening to the scores in sequence. You'll hear more than the evolution of a franchise, you'll hear the evolution of a composer. From intimate horror to operatic fantasy, to a mature artist returning to the world that helped define his career. And if you'd like to continue exploring The Evil Dead, be sure to visit Surgeons of Horror, where you'll find my retrospective series celebrating 45 years of the franchise, including The Evil Dead at 45 and From Cabin to High Rise. And you can also discover Library of the Occult episode 16, where we delve into the remarkable history of the Necronomicon, the fictional grimoire that somehow escaped the pages of literature to become one of horror's greatest cultural icons. Until next time, keep listening, because every great horror story has a heartbeat, and sometimes that heartbeat begins with a single note.